teach gender and sexuality here. And I think it's only fitting that I introduce Tina, who's a mentor and a friend of mine, and who I've TA'd for gender and sexuality at McMaster, and who taught me gender in grad school. Tina actively researches on the gay and lesbian movements in North America, and her topics have included the infamous activist Anita Bryant, have included gay-straight alliances in high schools, and more recently she's co-authored work with Bob Anderson investigating the role of social structures on attitudes towards homosexuality. She's also the author of the book, How the Religious Right Has Shaped Gay and Lesbian Activism, which studies the way that two movements can feed off of each other. So, with great pleasure, I introduce my friend and mentor, Tina Fetner, and I hope we find her talk very enlightening. Thank you.
We have a bit of a microphone issue, but so I think that I'll just, can you hear? Oh, that wasn't for me. Okay, so I'll just talk loud at first, and then when the microphone gets, then I'll try to dial it back. But so first, let me say that it's such a pleasure to be here. You can only imagine how great it is to have one of your students and friends be the one to introduce you to speak, and it's just so great to see how many people are here, and hopefully this talk will be interesting as well. So the presentation I'm giving today is based on an article that I published with my then colleague at McMaster, Bob Anderson, and you can, if you want to read it, it's probably in the library, right, in a political science journal, and to give you all the details, but I'm going to give you the highlights of what we found today. Is this a moment to turn it on? Okay, great. We'll see what I can do. How's that? Oh, that's much. I don't like to shout. Plus, my voice, as you know already, is very squeaky. So when I shout, it only makes it worse. So maybe I'll put this in my pocket. Okay, great. Okay, so the topic of the talk is attitudes toward homosexuality. And this is one of the few times in academia where you get to actually produce a research paper that is on something that you find really fascinating. Sometimes we get a little dry. Sometimes we get a little esoteric in our research topics. But it turns out that at this moment in time, attitudes toward homosexuality are a very interesting sociological topic, in addition to being something that might affect us in our everyday lives. And the reason for that is that attitudes toward homosexuality are changing rapidly right now. In the last 30 years, we've seen more change on the public opinion on this topic than other kinds of similarly seemingly controversial topics like racist attitudes, for example, xenophobic attitudes, anti-Semitic attitudes, have not changed nearly as fast as your generation, my generation, and in fact even generations older than us have changed their mind about homosexuality. And so the question, of course, is why, right? Why is this topic so different? What is it that's driving these attitude changes? We see not everyone agreeing, right? But we don't see, it's not just randomly sprinkled throughout the population. We see, in fact, pockets of social groups that have widely varying attitudes, different from each other, and from one country to the next. Right? We see a great deal of very accepting, tolerant attitudes in some countries, even if at one point in time, and very intolerant, unaccepting attitudes in another country at the same point in time. So, from a sociological perspective, this really begs the question, well, what is going on? What are the social conditions that are allowing this pattern change to happen now? And this is the question that we address in this paper. Now, before we get to that and to those findings, I think it might be a good idea for us to consider what our own kind of theory of how people change their minds about a topic like homosexuality. And so what are your ideas? What is it that shapes attitudes toward homosexuality? You have any ideas? Yeah.
Religious doctrine.
Religion, okay. Religious doctrine. Most religious doctrines hold that homosexuality is a sin or is a problem or have a negative view of homosexuality, so that would be something. Yeah?
The media.
The media, right, and the kind of messages that people are getting might be different from one country to another. Yeah? Yeah.
Family influence.
Absolutely, your family. Yeah? Any other? Yes?
History.
And how so history?
Well, in ancient times, homosexuality was a way to learn about your sexuality. And then times changed, religions changed, and it was found to be dirty or non-violence. And we thought it was dirty and not allowed, and now it's changing back.
Right, so the cultural context at different historical periods in time matters to what we think. It shapes the meaning of what homosexuality is. Okay, one more?
Personal experience.
Right, personal experience. Yes, absolutely. We see from surveys that people who have personal relationships, somebody that they know that's lesbian or gay, have different attitudes than somebody who's never met anyone that's lesbian or gay. So these are all things that matter. Most of the time, I think we think that we are all independently responsible for our own opinions, right? That we make up our own minds about everything really, but homosexuality would be one experience. And of course, sociology prefers to see the social patterns and to look at the social influences. And so we see how much is individual and how much is social. So we have a good deal of information because we've been collecting data on attitudes for a long time, and we know that, for example, gender makes a difference to attitudes toward homosexuality. And do you know which gender is more tolerant and which is more intolerant? Can you have a guess? Women are more tolerant and men are less tolerant. That's true, and you can start to think about why that might be. Sort of cultures of masculinity might have something to say about that. Here's an interesting one. Marital status makes a difference. People who are married are more or less tolerant? Less tolerant, right? Absolutely. And something about entering the institution of marriage, probably because of the values around marriage shapes attitudes toward homosexuality that way. You mentioned religion and religious doctrine, but what it turns out is that since religions are more or less consistent, now this is changing very recently, but up until 10 years ago, 20 years ago, religions were more or less consistently negative in their views toward homosexuality. Religion didn't matter much. What religion you belong to, say, didn't matter much. What mattered was how religious you were, right? Whether that's how often you attend services or how strong your beliefs were, and especially how much you were tied to orthodox or fundamentalist views of different religious belief patterns as opposed to more libertarian or liberal views. Okay, so we see these patterns, and one you also might expect that urban populations are more tolerant than rural populations, and this may well have something to do with what was mentioned in the back there, the idea of personal experiences having met somebody who's lesbian or gay. So it may be tied up with that kind of experiential social process, but also very individual and personal. Okay, so these are some individual attributes that we know make a difference in attitudes. There also are some cultural influences that are, I think, fairly straightforward when we're measuring this issue, including religion and religious doctrine, including education, right? So people who are more highly educated have more tolerant attitudes toward homosexuality and more liberal attitudes in general. So that's consistent with other social patterns of attitudes. The media was already an example that somebody used, and there you go, there's your bullet point, personal experience with meeting somebody. Okay, so these are things we know. We've been measuring this for, about 30 or 40 years now, and these are robust findings that last no matter what group we're talking about. But some political scientists thought that there might be something more, right? We didn't have the data to test cross-nationally until about the 1980s. And when we got that, our understandings of the macro structural influences on attitudes, these national differences, matter. And so what happened was, in one country or another, you might have demographic differences. Now, I don't know how many of you have taken demography, but basically it's just about counting up the social factors all together. And so something like an older population, a country with an older population, is going to have a different overall level of attitudes toward anything, including homosexuality, than a country with a younger population, right? Because we know there's generational differences. But a country with more immigrants are going to have a pattern of attitudes that match the country of origin, right? These things you would expect. And also something like whether it's a crime to have a same-sex sexual experience, right? Matters a lot to attitudes. People take the cues of the social structure around them, and so if you live in a country where homosexuality is criminalized, chances are your attitudes are going to be quite negative toward homosexuality. So these are pretty basic, and I'll skip through them quite quickly. Let me land on an important, influential idea about the social structural influences on attitudes. Now, it's got a big name, and I'm sorry, I did not name it, and I really dislike jargon in general. But so it's not me, but it's Ron Engelhardt. You can talk to him. He's a political scientist. And he was the designer of a big survey where they asked values-related questions to representative samples of people from lots of different countries.